How's it going, everyone? It's Chow here, and today we are going to talk a little bit about plant physiology. So let's get started. So just as a heads up, I am not a botanist because botany is very difficult and I don't know much about it. But let's go through this in the most basic terms that's possible for the scope of the course. So in regards to our ecosystem, Earth is actually a closed system with respect to matter. But it is open with respect to energy, and my heating just turned on, so hopefully that isn't going to interfere with this too much. And this whole concept is driven by the sun. So elements move around the Earth in cycles, for instance, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and then you also have things such as the water cycle. And it's going to be cycled often, these elements are often going to be cycled between organic and inorganic forms. We can use certain terms to kind of look at the presence or absence and location of these elements. So for example, we have flux, which is the rate at which elements are moved through the cycle. We have the pool, which is where elements accumulate. And finally, we have the sink, which is where elements are kind of taken out of the cycle for an extended period of time. Of course, the one key thing that plants can do, and a lot of important oxygen-producing organisms can do, is this concept of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis evolved about 2.5 to maybe 2.8, 2.9 billion years ago. You can see different numbers depending on the source. And photosynthesis basically converts sunlight energy or light energy to more of a biological energy. Some of the first organisms to do the whole photosynthetic thing is actually the cyanobacteria. So it's able to change the atmosphere through the splitting of, it takes hydrogen ions from water and releases O2 in the process, and this actually allows for O2 accumulation in the atmosphere, which eventually over time change the atmosphere so that aerobic organisms, which depend on oxygen, to exist and eventually diversify and flourish. Of course, our atmosphere is mostly nitrogen with only some oxygen and very little CO2. Of course, CO2 then is very important, but it is also interesting because it is the most oxidized form of carbon. So it is relatively stable, but doesn't necessarily carry a lot of energy. Now, eventually over time, you have organisms that became able to reduce the CO2. It's unfortunately quite energetic, so oftentimes energy from the sun is going to be used. And then finally, through the reduction of CO2, it made carbon from CO2 useful to other organisms. So there you go. Now, carbon and oxygen also is going to be flowing through the cycle. So we have these things called photosynthesizers, which are often primary producers, and they're going to be taking solar energy that enters through the system and basically allow for use by other organisms. So some of the energy that they assimilate, right? So you have the solar energy that's coming into the system through these organisms. Obviously, some of the energy that they assimilate, they will actually use for their own metabolism. You're going to collect that energy, you're going to use some of it. So that's what plants do and other photosynthetic organisms. They use some of that energy, but the rest is available to consumers. So we call this net primary production. And net primary productivity is this idea this term that can be used to measure, right, energy flowing in. If you look at the globe as a whole, the oceans and the tropics are generally the most important in terms of net primary production, and over 2/3 of the world's net primary production is from the oceans and the tropics. So there's that. But when we look at the carbon cycle itself, one thing that we can see is that all organisms actually contain carbon. So carbon is organic. That's why we have a lot of carbon molecules in organic chemistry, right? So energy comes from carbon compounds. Now, CO2 is going to be reduced to organic compounds, and then so we're going to be removing the carbon from the atmosphere via photosynthesis. So in order to get rid of that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we go through photosynthesis. Eventually, we have metabolism that returns carbon to the atmosphere as CO2. We can see in this diagram that carbon pools in the ocean and carbon actually occurs as a sink in the form of rocks and fossil fuels. And just as a side note, today carbon dioxide production is actually exceeding the consumption. So basically we're putting out more carbon than is being taken in. And obviously that can have strong implications. Of course, as a scientist, it's very important to also scrutinize and analyze and carefully look at the data itself to see whether, global warming or climate change is occurring by looking at some of these shifts in these numbers. So that's something that you as a scientist can go do yourself. Now, if we're looking at carbon itself and these photosynthesizers, we can kind of group them into certain groups. And these organisms that are living on this planet that's doing some kind of an effect on the carbon and oxygen cycle, we can actually label these. So the first group are the autotrophs. So the autotrophs are going to be your producers, like your plants and algae and some bacteria. And they're going to be going through and doing this process of photosynthesis. So here you have the equation of photosynthesis, where you're taking carbon dioxide and water plus energy from the sun to make a sugar molecule and oxygen. So the reduced form of oxygen, which is water, is going to be changed to the oxidized form of oxygen, which is O2. Carbon dioxide is the oxidized form. It's the most oxidized form, and it goes to the reduced form, which is the sugar, which can be potentially glucose. H2O, which is water, is very stable. So that stability is what contributes to that uphill battle. Obviously, when it comes to photosynthesis, the waste products of these producers or these autotrophs can end up being fuels for the consumers. So we can talk a little bit about those consumers for a brief second here, and those consumers are called the heterotrophs. So they're things like animals and fungi and some bacteria. And what heterotrophs are going to be doing is they're going to be going through respiration or aerobic metabolism, where you're taking oxygen as well as sugars to create energy and have those byproducts of water and CO2. So the heterotroph waste products, such as CO2, are going to end up being the fuels for your autotrophs up here, as we can see from those formulas. Okay, brief information about the plant. The plant itself is going to be doing this particular thing over here, which is the photosynthesis equation. This is actually the more general, this is the more specific photosynthetic equation. There you go. And you can see that we're taking 6 CO2 molecules, 6 water molecules to make glucose, as well as 6 O2 molecules. So this is more of a balanced equation over here. So we're going to take in CO2 to make carbohydrates in the most basic way to describe it, and we're going to be using water and then releasing oxygen as a byproduct. Now, when it comes to the plant and its whole concept of photosynthesis, it actually takes 2 pathways. We have light reactions, which convert light to ATP and NADPH, and then we also have light-independent reactions. So you can think about it as light-dependent or light reactions and light-independent reactions, sometimes known as the dark reactions. And these light-independent reactions then are going to use the ATP and NADPH from these light-dependent reactions, and it's going to add that CO2, right, to ultimately make sugars. So sugars, carbohydrates, glucose, things like that. So that's the general overview of plant physiology, and we will go into a little bit more detail about these light reactions and light-independent reactions in following videos.